All right, well, with that, let's turn over to the politics portion of the podcast. Um, in this portion, we will be reviewing Plato's Book 4, examined last week, before moving on to Book 5. All right, so the beginning of Book 4 starts with Adeimantus interrupting Plato's narration of the good state. Sorry, guys, I got to stop here. I really need to drink some water. H2O. Okay, good stuff. All right, let me go to the start of that paragraph. All right. The beginning of Book 4 starts with Adeimantus interrupting Plato's narration of the good state, arguing that the provisions for the guardian class wouldn't make them happy. If you'll remember, Plato's response was that the end being aimed at was not merely the good of any individual, but rather the good of the whole. In this way, guardians give up money, property, and fame to better enable them to guard the city. Once again, Plato emphasizes the need for musical and gymnastic training in forming guardians. From this conversation, things start to escalate rather quickly, though. Plato argues that there are four virtues in the state: wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice, and argues that in defining the first three, justice will be that part which is left over after having considered the other three virtues. So he begins to consider by considering the other three virtues to see if he can find out what justice is. Starting with wisdom, he argues that it is that by which a city is well counseled. With courage, courage is the correct way to fear. That is, fear of the things that ought to be feared, and uh, and courage in the face of things that ought not to be feared. Um, while moderation is agreement over who should rule. All right, so what does this leave out? What part does this leave for justice? Well, justice is just. Plato argues that the thing left over is um, the doing of what is properly one's own. So justice is the doing of what is properly one's own. Remember the two controlling principles of the Republic. The first is that studying justice in the origin of a city should lead us to justice in the state, while a knowledge of justice in the state should lead us to a knowledge of justice in the individual. So, having discovered the first two, it is not surprising at all that Plato turns to justice in the individual now, after having defined justice in the state. Here he sets up his famous theory of the tripartite soul, arguing that just as there are three parts to the city, so there are three in the individual: a reasoning part, a spirited part, and a desiring part. The reasoning part is naturally associated with wisdom, the spirited to courage, and the desiring to moderation. Here, as with the city, then, justice in the individual means the doing of each part what is properly its own, exactly like the justice in the city: the rational to rule, the spirited to assist, and the desiring part to be led. This is why musical and gymnastic training are so important in Plato's view as well, since both of them discipline the desiring part to be in accord with the rational and spirited part. And remember that really long conversation that we, or really long, um, yeah, remember how long Plato went talking about musical and gymnastic training in book 3, where he just goes on and on and on about like accepted forms of music and then correct ways to exercise and just all of these different things. And the reason for that is to is so that the rational and spirited part can master the desiring part and lead them to uh, where where they're supposed to go. Okay, so that was the recap. We haven't even got into book 5 yet. So that was the recap. All right, now we arrive at book 5. So book 5 starts once again with Adeimantus interrupting Socrates, but this time over the holding of men, women, and children in common in the guardian class, rather than uh, the argument that the guardians are not being set up to, rather than the argument that the guardians won't be happy under the system. So, in arguing for this view, Socrates takes the example of female dogs hunting with male dogs as an example of the equality that should exist between males and females. Beginning quote. Music and gymnastic exercise were given to the men. Therefore, this pair of arts needs to be made available to the woman too, as well as the things connected with war, and they need to be applied in the same manner. In justifying this claim, Socrates argues that men and women have different natures, but only with respect to childbearing and not with respect to anything else. In describing the current state of things, Glaucon, the person who kind of Socrates' yaysayer, the person that Socrates is conversing with, Glaucon also argues that women are being repressed unfairly, a view that Socrates agrees with. Beginning quote, "You're telling the truth, that the one kind is dominated by the other by far in everything, as one might put it. But many women are certainly better than many men at many things, though on the whole, it's the way you say." End quote. So, turning to the family now, Socrates answers the original question that Adeimantus put forward by arguing that all wives should be held in common with all men, as well as children. He argues, uh, beginning quote, "It follows from the things that have been agreed to that as often as possible the best men ought to have sex with the best woman, and the worst on the contrary with the worst, and the offspring of the former ought to be reared, but not those of the latter, if the flock is going to be of top quality to the highest degree possible. And all these things ought to happen without the notice of anyone except the rulers themselves, if the guardian's herd is also going to be as free as possible from internal conflict." Okay, so that was a bit of a doozy argument there. Um, so I think we saw in book 4 how Socrates proposed using the justice system and the medical system to for the purpose of breeding, basically breeding the best form of men possible, and also for population control. So what he's saying here in terms of like the best man having sex with the best woman, that goes back to the breeding point that he made earlier about how the best way to get that the best should sleep with the best so that the children turn out to be the best. And yeah, I think there may be a quote coming. I might be jumping the gun a little bit again, but there might be a quote coming that says that, dang it. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Let me think. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not remembering it. Sorry about that. Yeah, I just kind of had a mental block there. But yeah, we should be. There we go. Okay, so that's what it was. So the children of the best parents ought to be reared, while the children of the worst parents, or any children who are defective, ought to be put in a place not to be spoken of. So, um, yes, so Socrates argues that those born in one generation are not to have sex with those of another generation. So again, remember that I'm only presenting what Plato is saying here, not an actual critique of it. So the critique will come after we're done with book 10 and the entire thing, and then we can really get into it. But this is just for stating the other side's best case. So just saying what they would say and trying to make their arguments as strong as possible. So we're not knocking down straw men. All right. So turning now to the state, Socrates argues that just as when a finger is hurt and is felt by the entire body, so a city will be affected by the least bit of good or bad that happens to its members. Thus, in this way, people will claim the pleasures and pain of everyone else as their own. Beginning quote. Therefore, when any one person is doing well or badly, people will sound out in harmony the word we were just speaking, that what's mine is going well or what's mine is going badly. Socrates now circles back to the family to examine the upbringing of children. He argues that besides the fact that they should all be held in common, children should witness the craft to which they will later practice, namely warfare for the guardians. Thus, children should go to war as well as women and men to observe, being saddled on horses so as to escape if need be. For men who have the highest distinction, Glaucon, remember that's the guy that Socrates is conversing with, Glaucon argues that they should be allowed to kiss anyone they like, male or female. A further law is added that no guardians should ravage land or burn houses. Okay, so before Socrates carries on, Glaucon asks Socrates whether any of this is possible. Socrates responds that he was only examining it from the point of view of what justice is, rather than a view towards the possibility of bringing the city into being. As a concession to Glaucon's request, though, Socrates argues that there are some changes that could be made to existing governments right away, which would set the wheels in motion towards the ideal city. The first of these changes is Plato's famous exposition on philosopher kings. Socrates argues that, beginning quote, unless philosophers rule as kings in their cities, or those now called kings and supreme rulers genuinely and adequately engage in philosophy, and this combination of political power and philosophy joins together in the same position, this polity that we've now gone over in speech will never before that sprout as far as it can and see the light of sun. To back up this claim, Socrates proposes a deeper dive into what philosophy refers to and how it can be joined to a ruler effectively. So basically, what he's saying here is that um, the proper king should be one who is a lover of knowledge and one who's not merely like the most powerful or the most popular or anything like that. You need a mixture of someone who loves the truth and someone who is able to administrate government. So, back at this plane, Socrates begins by arguing that since things are desired in whole and not in part, philosophers desire the whole of wisdom rather than a part of it. As to what wisdom is, Socrates argues that it's the love of the sight of truth. When questioned further on this point, Plato introduces his theory of forms. And we're not going to get into that here because I believe it's explained more fully in the next book. But this is kind of this is reliant on Plato. This is an example of Plato's theory of the forms. Okay, so Plato is arguing that there is some sort of form for everything that exists that is unified with itself. So there is a unified form for goodness and one for evil, and one for like almost everything basically, even though good and evil manifest themselves in vastly different ways, i.e., the good manifests itself in people in different ways and is almost always mixed with evil, excepting like the greatest saints possibly, and Mary. But nevertheless, the forms themselves are pure and really existing things under Plato's theory. So, from this point, Socrates argues that those who love wisdom accept this reality, while those with opinions accept only the seeming of reality, in taking goodness and evil to be many rather than one. So beginning quote, then as for those who gaze upon many beautiful things but don't see the beautiful itself, and aren't even capable of following someone else who leads them to it, and upon many just things but not the just itself, and all the things like that, will claim that they accept the seeming of everything but discern nothing of what they have opinions about. So what he's saying here is that basically um, beauty manifests itself in different objects or different things, and you and that those commonalities between those beautiful things can be said to make up are all participate in the form of beauty, which is just this sort of like existent thing that is making all of these artifacts or people or whatever good in some way, and same thing with evil. So developing this idea of opinion further, and yeah, so the philosopher is the one who sees that truth, that the beautiful is one, that the evil is one, that the good is one, and the lovers of opinion are those who accept only the seeming, only the part of beauty that is there in front of them, and beauty, but they only accepting the beauty that's in front of them, but not linking it to any beauty that they see anywhere else. So they just, there's no, they only go on seeming. There's no desire to try to merge everything together and figure out what what the relationship between beautiful things is. So, developing this idea of opinion further, Socrates argues that since accepting that the seeming is a different capacity than knowledge of reality, opinion and knowledge must be two different capacities in the soul, with opinion in between ignorance and knowledge. Beginning quote. Well, weren't we claiming that in the earlier discussion that if anything would come to light as a sort of thing that is and is not at the same time, such a thing would lie between what is purely and simply and what in every way is not, and that neither knowledge nor ignorance would be directed at it, but instead something that came to light as between ignorance and knowledge. Therefore, this in-between capacity is called opinion and is distinct from the capacity for knowledge, the knowledge of which alone can be termed a love of wisdom. Beginning quote. Therefore, those who devote themselves to each thing itself that is ought to be called philosophers and not lovers of opinion. Okay, so in conclusion then, Socrates argues that among the guardian class, men, women, and children should all be held in common, and that the fittest men should make love to women so as to breed the best possible children. All those children that are defective, however, should be put in a place never to be spoken of. Socrates argues further that women and men should do the same things as each other, since the only difference between them is their child-rearing capability. When asked if any of this is possible by Glaucon, Socrates argues that it might take a while and argues that the only step in this direction is to have a philosopher king so that philosophical insight can be merged with political power. When pressed on the philosophical aspect of it, Socrates argues that there are unique and really existent forms of goodness and evil that manifest themselves as many in this world, but are really manifest themselves as many in this world, but are really reflections of these existent forms. So that's what I was kind of talking about with beautiful things participating in the form of beauty. To develop this further, Socrates argues that between ignorance and knowledge is a middle capacity opinion which grasps the seeming of things but not their true reality. Knowledge, on the other hand, is that which goes beyond the seeming and grasps the true reality of things. Thus, the love of the knowledge of the true reality of things is called wisdom. Oof, okay, well, that about does it for the politics side of things. Hopefully, you guys are able to follow that. Book 5 is really quite a doozy. There's just a lot of content there. Same with book 4. And I think book 6, we're going to be looking at Plato's theory of the forms. Not sure if it's quite as long as book 5, but I'm thinking we'll probably stick with one book per episode because they're definitely starting to get a little longer. All right, well, with that, let's turn it over to the economics section.